So, welcome everyone. In case you don't know me, I'm Ryane, and welcome to the first ever Rainbow Space Magic Convention. This is the queer, Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color representation in speculative fiction panel. So, without further ado, let us go and introduce our panelists. José?
Hello. For those of you who don't know me, I'm José Pablo Iriarte. I am a Cuban-American non-binary writer of primarily contemporary fantasy, but I also write a tiny little bit of science fiction. And I'm more known for my short fiction so far than my long fiction. I've had stories published in Lightspeed magazine, Strange Horizons magazine, Fireside Fiction, a whole bunch of other places. I've been nominated for the Nebula Award, nominated for the Tiptree Award, and I've had stories reprinted in the year's best transgender science speculative fiction and in the Hugo Award long list anthology. And that's
Nikki?
I have to go after that? Really? I'm like, I can count a potato, y'all. Okay. All right, my name is Nikki Woolfolk. I am an author and a chocolatier. One of the things that I'm known for is I write a lot of humor, no matter what the subject matter is, no matter what the genre is. So a lot of the speculative fiction that I write is steampunk, but there's always that twist of humor as well as the addressing society, but in a different way. It was one of those things that I learned in the middle of writing that I wrote to cheer myself up, because every time I wrote like urban fantasy, I depressed the hell out of myself. So I found that it was better if I wrote speculative fiction, and also when I did it with humor, I could still address issues. So that's partially where I come from with my background. Also the chocolatier part, I found I kept writing about food. I kept writing about food in all my books. And then I'd have my friends read the books, and then they were like ready to like shank me because they'd get hungry. So the deal was I had to make chocolates that matched what I was mentioning in the books before they read them. And then it became, well, the books sell a little bit, but the chocolates sell a lot more. So I ended up having like a little chocolate company on top of the work that I do. So I still write murder mystery, speculative fiction, and yeah.
Nice. And Arshad?
Hi, my name's Arshad Essendine. I write gay, bisexual, sci-fi and fantasy. My day job, I'm a doctor and I'm a hematopathologist. What else can I say? That's about it.
And I'm Ryane. I'm a reader, and I'm an editor. I'm a technical editor for my day job. I work for the U.S. federal government. I read everything: romance, science fiction, fantasy, mystery, thriller, horror, cereal boxes, shampoo bottles. Not really picky. But my heart lies in science fiction and fantasy. That's really where my mom, my granddad got me started really reading a lot. And it was a great way for me to escape just the boringness of school. Okay. So for our first topic, and I'm going to leave this to all of our authors because I don't write. Our first topic is going to be their experiences writing Black, Indigenous, and other characters of color, the highs and lows, their receptions, and their experiences doing that. José, would you like to start?
Sure. I have an experience that I think is probably very common to a lot of other folks who are like me, and that is that there came a point where I looked at all of the stories I'd written and realized that I was only writing stories about Anglo characters. And I'll go further and say that I was only writing stories about heterosexual Anglo characters, neither of which is me. And at some point, like a light bulb went off, and I said, well, why am I doing this, and where did I learn this from? And I realized that I had internalized the notion that this is what a protagonist must be. And then I started going about trying to write characters whose experiences more closely resembled my experiences. And there came a point where I was looking over the stories that I had sold and looking over the stories that I had written, and maybe half of the stories that I'd written, I'd reached a point where half of them featured either characters who were queer or Latinx or both, and yet the vast majority of the stories that I had actually sold were not those, and so that, you know, that spoke to something that that maybe in the marketplace needed some correction. And I've kind of leaned hard into that, that as the years go by, I don't want to write about a character who doesn't share at least one marginalization with me anymore, ever again.
Nice.
Very. Nikki?
Oh, pretty much along the same lines. When I was talking about how I used to write urban fiction, I would depress myself and I couldn't figure out why. It was partially I was writing about some really heavy stuff without humor, so it took me a while. But like Jose, I had an issue where when I would write characters for stories, including the science fiction, they were always white, male, and I couldn't relate to these characters, and I felt like I was trying to walk through mud. And I remember I was in the middle of writing Maison Death, which is a steampunk murder mystery that I later on published. And I discovered that one, my character was super bisexual, like super.
Ooh, yay.
And I was like, yay. And not only that, but she is Black. And I didn't see that in science fiction. I didn't see that in steampunk, really. And she was my main character. And that's when I started realizing that not only did I want to see more representation of people like me, but also seeing it in science fiction, especially with steampunk, where it's just, I noticed a lot of times the world still stayed the same. Everybody's just wearing brown. And I'm like, you know what? I'm really not down for that. And so I changed the script, which was, what would happen to us psychologically if the Civil War never happened? What would happen to, and it's like, what would happen to us as people of color, as Black people? What would we do in a society that no longer doesn't like us? What would our technology be? And so I went with that. And so one of the other things I decided is I didn't want to read afternoon school specials. I know I'm dating myself, but but I mean, really, because it was, like, your choices with being queer when it came to genre writing back in my day was erotica or a tragic story where everybody died, or, you know, and so I didn't want to read that anymore. I was depressing myself. So I thought, okay, let me write something that cheers me up. And so I write a lot of humor, a lot of comedy, but I also like murder mysteries. So I was like, okay, we're going to have dead bodies, but it's going to be funny. So it kind of, it threw people off, because some people were like, what do you mean you have these Black characters that are main characters in steampunk? Why would you do that? And I'm like, why not? So it became that instead of me trying to fight it, it was just like, okay, this is what it is. This is where I'm coming from. And the more I wrote from that perspective, the funnier I found my voice. And it was one of those things that helped me move along. Murder mysteries are cheery if you kill the right people.
Yeah, I was like, as I'm sitting here thinking, I do love cute murdery books.
And that's the thing. So, you know, I grew up on that. I grew up with detective novels and things like that, and film noir, but I wanted to write about us. And I didn't want to make it where it was always tragedy. Instead, it was, I wanted to write from a place of joy where we have our own adventures. So, yeah.
I love it. Arshad?
Hi, how should I put this? Basically, when I was in college, my fraternity was very diverse and inclusive. And so it was, you know, male and female, all races, all creeds, that sort of thing. So I came home one day and all of my fraternity brothers and sisters were sitting in a circle on a whim and just for fun. And we're comparing notes and trying to decide who was oppressing each other the most. I walked in and I said, I'm Indian, no one's oppressing me. And they all threw up their hands and said, that's even worse than being oppressed. You're marginalized. So my experience has been that really I haven't had an experience of being discriminated based on race. So, I mean, being gay and Muslim in this kind of, in the US is really not a picnic, but race has never been an issue for me. So when I write sci-fi and fantasy, those are worlds where I control, and I can set them up so all these things exist, but are not an issue. That's kind of what I aim for. Where, for example, if I go forward in time to a society where you have people who have relationships with men or women or whatever, that it doesn't matter and no one even remarks upon it. So that's kind of my goal. Same thing for race, same thing for religion, though I haven't really gone into that too much explicitly. The current book that I'm working on is sort of a clash of cultures between European and Native American. So in a sense, that's race, but it's really focusing on the culture and the imperialism there. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay, and for the little bit of reader perspective, I often find that I read reviews. I think everyone who knows me knows that I read reviews, and a lot of times when I'm looking through reviews, I do look at the 1 stars just so that I can see if there's content available in the book that I'm looking for. Really, that's how I actually came across Arshad's books, and I was like, oh, I love this. And as I was reading them, while his stories aren't self-insert, I felt more at home within his stories. I've read some of José's books or stories, and it's the same thing. Same thing with Nikki as well. It's more of a home feeling. I don't feel like the odd man out while I'm reading this, or I'm reading something where someone's checkboxing characters. They exist, and they exist, well, even if they're not happy. Their ethnicity, their race is not a factor. They just happen to be they happen to be. And that's really, really important for readers to have characters that are and that don't exist as a checkbox, because none of us are checkboxes. So actually, you guys have covered 2 a little bit, but we're gonna go into that a little bit more. So what do you all factor in as part of your character development versus the character's aesthetic? What are the things you like to write for characters? I know some authors like to write like your super grumpy cutie pie. Some of them are just your super murdery teeny tiny little hobbit sized, you don't know this is your axe murderer or your ship captain or your badass witch. How do you balance your aesthetics along with your character development?
Do you mind if I go?
Go ahead.
Okay.
So
My perspective, I start off with food. Let me preface this. I was not really into food until like probably about 12 years ago. But I started noticing that whenever I would write either a character, it would remind me of certain types of food. Like that person, it's either food or it becomes a meal. So a scene would end up being fleshed out, and it felt like I was either, when I'm writing about Italian strawberry shortcake, it was consisting of this scene where certain points are being noted, red herrings are being placed, but since one of my sleuths is a chef, applying not only the aspect of, okay, here's the murder mystery, here are the pieces, but also the food ties into things. It is part of the setting. So yes, I'm conveying information, but also because I'm writing about food, the food becomes a personality, a character within itself. It's one of those, I didn't realize I had an association with it until I started writing further. And it was something I noticed that wasn't really in sci-fi. Nobody eats. I got a problem with that. I'm like, how you're not going to eat? Like, we look at all these aspects of sci-fi, but I don't really see a lot of the hospitality aspects and the food which brings people together. You know, family
Yes.
meals. And it doesn't just mean family with blood relatives, but family that you make. And I don't know about the other two, but I find that throughout the years, I found I had more acceptance with the friends that I made that are my family. And so I end up writing from there. So a lot of my characters, it will always be where there's a tie to food and it's a tie to those characters. And from there, that's where I start to build. People will remind me of certain foods and I will grow from there and start putting out like personalities based on what I see. So
I like that. Plus, you know, if you want to provide recipes, you know, I'm okay with that.
My characters, for some reason, I'm most at home writing either about teenage characters or characters who are past middle age and heading on into elderly. For some reason,
all right.
I seem to end up a lot. And with the teenage ones, it's pretty easy or to see why I end up there. I'm a high school teacher, so I'm in contact with a lot of teenagers. And also, your teenage years are when you're working through a lot of questions of identity that are really powerful and interesting questions. I want to kind of touch on to something Arshad said earlier, because I don't think I write a lot of stories that are about oppression, but I do write about identity. For instance, I write a lot about characters who are living in diasporas, because that's my experience of growing up as a Miami Cuban, and kind of trying to figure out, you know, you've got these relatives who feel like you need to honor their traditions, and you've got this mass culture that says this is what you need to walk, and then kind of trying to figure out, okay, where am I in all of that? So that's something that I'm drawn to a lot. From the food thing, weirdly enough, like I noticed this only in hindsight, but I have a lot of stories where coffee is really central.
Yes.
Yes.
In a week and a half is basically coffee is extinct, and that an espresso maker finds new life in that story.
All
And
right.
I write about rum rather a lot. I'm not sure what that says about me, but there it is.
Arshad, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I've heard once that all fiction is autobiography. It's really you speaking through the voice of all the different characters. So I usually take pains to, in order to separate the characters from me, none of them really represent me. So I don't look for representation of Indians or things that really fit into who I am, so that I can speak through the characters being more as a platform, a fictional mouthpiece. But I don't want to get too much of myself in it, because then it contaminates the story. That's just kind of my thought. I don't know if that's, I mean, most people kind of argue the opposite. But as far as the aesthetics goes, that's why, well, there aren't Indians in my story for one reason. But as far as what kind of characters I write, I usually try to go with kind of the emotional thing. You know, I want someone who is confident yet conflicted about different things. So the contrast within the character, I like to go for the internal conflict. That's where I aim for.
Okay.
As opposed to the
conflict. That's a great answer as well, because that's something I do find in your books that I feel more drawn in emotionally. And Bruce has made an appearance. Okay, so I'm looking very forward to this question. Favorite authors, and authors of color. Also, because I'm going to throw in our secondary question, what characters in books that you've read that don't necessarily default to white? Because I've got some where people have argued me down in Goodreads, and I'm not letting it go. But the characters to me don't necessarily default as white, and it's probably me. However, disgusting reading. My nephew reads a lot. My mother reads a lot, and we run into that quite a bit, where the author leaves the character description open-ended enough that you're like, this is what the character looks like to me personally.
Yeah.
So, Jose?
I mean, the big first obvious recommendation that comes to mind is Chip Delaney. But Alberto Yanez had a story in Strange Horizons. It was called Recognizing Gabe, Un Cuento de Hadas, which is basically a transgender fairy tale set in the American Southwest. It was just a beautiful, amazing story that ripped my heart out. And I am always looking for the hardcore heavy feels. That's what I'm looking for. I just this past year read Anne Marie McLemore's young adult novel, When the Moon Was Ours, which has an Indian protagonist and a Latin America or a Latinx protagonist. It has one of the protagonists is trans. It's got other trans and queer characters, and the writing is just beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful emotional book. And another person I throw out there is Carmen Maria Machado, which I think she may have novels out there, but I primarily know her through her short stories. She's got one called The Husband Stitch, which if you've heard of The Husband Stitch, you kind of know what that's about. But also trying to remember, she has a short horror story. Let's see if I can remember what it's called. And I'm actually, and I'm not usually much of a horror reader, but Descent was a horror story that she had a few years out. So those are ones that just come to my mind.
Nikki?
It's been a while since I have had the pleasure of reading fiction, I'm sorry to say. I've got a lot on my plate, so I've been under a rock, don't be mad. For me, like a lot of people, started off with Octavia Butler. I usually read things in order. I didn't realize it when I found her Imago, the Xenogenesis series. I found the third book. I didn't realize that was, for me, that was like, oh, this is amazing, because it not only had these beings that really had no gender. So I was like, oh, okay, this describes me more of how I see myself than anything I've ever read. And then at the same time, there are these sexual moments that are blended between different genders. And I was like, oh, I feel so connected to this. And I looked for more of her books that way. And then I started looking for more sci-fi authors in that manner. And I didn't find as much. So clearly I need to chat with everyone else so I can, come from one out of my rock. But one of the other authors, not a person of color, but I noted something because it was how I was introduced to Neil Gaiman and his work. The first book that I ever read was Anansi Boys. I thought it was a brother. I thought he was a brother. I was like, oh, okay, he's an Englishman. And I'm like, woo, he's non-melanin. That's okay. But I'm sitting there reading about Fat Charlie, the main character. I'm reading about all these people, and I noted, and it helped me in my own writing, where the way that he wrote it was he didn't mention anyone's color unless they weren't Black. And if you look back on it, I'm like, okay, I like that better. So when it came to my own writing and I was starting to get confident, I didn't want to, yes, I wanted my own representation, but I didn't want to go with the mindset of like, and she was blackity black, 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 black,
Right.
It's like, okay, that's fine. I want to get to the story. And so I wrestled with one of my editors with that, because they were like, well, you need to do more description. And I'm like, I'd rather get to the story. you know, the funny is there. I want to get to the funny. And it was like, well, you have to describe what they look like. And I'm like, it's not that I didn't want that representation, but I figured dole it out in pieces like breadcrumbs. And, you know, we don't do that with white characters where it's like, and their skin was so pale. Let me go down this long list of descriptions. And it's like, why not just leave little breadcrumbs there?
Mhm.
So it's just one of those things.
Like description was like, oh, they had pale skin and blue eyes and red hair.
I'm like, yeah, when I did write the description, I was already like in a frustrated mood. So I wrote it in such a manner that it gave the readers what they may have wanted, but I also added a little bit more. And later on in my stories, I describe people up to a certain point, but I'm moving with the story. That's where my focus is. When it comes to other authors, I like emotional, like José, but I don't want to be sad. I'm such a like,
make me cry. I'm here for it.
I'm just like, I understand that, but then I get like really mad. I'm like, you made me sad. You made me have feelings. I don't like this. So I'm okay with feelings, but it's like, okay, that's nice. Can we, you know, let's have explosions, blow things up, you know, so within my stories. But yeah, I do like that emotional pull, all joking aside. And I'm finding that when it comes to urban fiction, lately I've been reading off and on a lot of writers of color, because it makes more sense to me when you're reading urban fiction. You know, I used to wonder, like, where are the Black people? Like, you're saying urban fiction and there's like no Black people. And I'm like, I don't know about you, but in urban areas, there's people of color. So yeah, it was one of those things that I noticed. So I probably did not even answer that question. I went on my own little tangent. I'm sorry.
No, it's good though. It is good. I got critters running around. Arshad?
As far as writers of color or characters of color, one thing that I really couldn't think of anything, and I just thought of something just now, which was a book written by Ian MacDonald, who writes a lot of hard sci-fi. And his name is MacDonald, so I don't think he's Indian. But it was called River of Gods, which refers to the Ganges, I think. And in it, it was set in India, so most of the characters were Indian. And then there were artificial intelligences who had obviously no bodies. And then there were what they called newts, who were non-binary people who had like no really distinguishing characteristics. They had altered themselves so they had nothing that would distinguish them deliberately. So that was interesting. Let's see. Yeah, I know Ian MacDonald is Scottish, I guess. What I meant is he's not Indian with the name like that. That's usually. Let's see. What else was I going to say? Well, I don't know. Well, okay, I'm confused, so I'm going to stop.
Okay. So I'll go. And I'm a power reader. That's pretty much what I do. I'm not a big TV watcher. So probably my favorite Octavia Butler book is Bloodchild. It was gory, super emotional, but creepy with the insects and the women. The insects were, I would almost classify them as intersex, but for breeding purposes, the human males were used and were expected to carry the insect eggs to term because a human body was not viable. Then let's see who else. N.K. Jameson is completely hands down. Anything by her, but if you're looking for like a really short intro to her writing, I would recommend Emergency Skin. I'm not gonna lie, I cried through most of it, through like the first, I see I did it audio, so like the first 30 minutes I was crying. Um, for for my book, huh?
I said a 30-minute cry. That's quite an achievement on the author's
It's not often, because in the last probably 3 years, I would say Emergency Skin, Three Body Problem, and the next book I'm going to mention. While there, I'm not sure because it's a new book in the series, but it's by Joe Abercrombie, and the first book is called A Little Hatred, and he's a little bit of queer baiting. I'm not really sure where he's going with this one particular character because the second book doesn't come out till September.
Okay.
However, his books, this series has kind of got this steampunk feel to it, and it is set in Europe, but he's got characters that are very distinctly not white. It's obvious they're not, but out of the four, the book revolves specifically around the women. The plot cannot move without their involvement, which is really fascinating because a lot of times I find when men in particular write women, they don't write them in a way that they save themselves, that they are the protagonist. The story depends on their movements. But out of the four main characters, the women, to me, three of them just didn't feel European to me. And you can find my review on Goodreads and watch people argue. I got new comments today, but it's the way I feel. And that's, for me, a big talent, and it's not really a talent, it's a skill that authors have, to allow the reader to be in the story without taking over the story, and to take the story with them. And I finished that book in January, February, and I'm still like wowed by the whole story. And that's a very short list of the things I've read in the last 6 months. But just, I'm a gamer, so I want to add that aspect of storytelling. The Shuffle Papers, Borderlands franchise, NeoCab, Guild Wars franchise, Life is Strange franchise, and Mixed Messages. All of these games are very, very inclusive, and they're very, very diverse, and they are not checkbox characters. They exist. They are being themselves. The characters are, some of the characters are queer, in all different shades. With Guild Wars being a MMO, you can make your character and your story however you wish. And as the story progresses, you can start seeing your choices in the actual environment of the game.
Nice.
So, and this is one of those when I'm editing, I'm telling my authors, I ask them, what have you been reading lately? What have you been doing lately? Oh, well, I've been, watching Mom, which is my favorite sitcom. But I'll tell them to go watch a playthrough of a game. Watch the actual story playthrough. That way you can see that you can still do characters of color not being a person of color, and you can still have them be the main protagonist, have their own storylines, but you just have to let them be. And a wider berth of media often allows that to happen. And by all means, never go on Twitter and ask a question like that. How do I write? Because I'm probably going to see it and it won't go well. So we are at the do's and don'ts. Who would like to go first?
I can just mention one thing. There was a book that I read. It was published by a well-regarded publisher in gay romance by two well-respected authors. And one of the two protagonists was Arab American Muslim gay. But there was nothing there. I mean, they said that's what it was, but he never did anything to engage with his Muslim or his Arab identity. They had one scene where he was like hanging out with his brother on the deck, drinking beers. And so you're saying, well, typically there would be some conflict with the culture and the religion. And two, Muslims don't usually sit around drinking beer because it's haram. You're not supposed to do that. And to me, it just felt like it was like a colored Post-it note that was like taped onto the character. That was his whole ethnic and religious identity. And that just pissed me off. I mean, it has to, if they had given some backstory to say why they were accepting, why he was breaking the commandments because he didn't believe in it or what, but because of his conflicts and stuff like that, that would make sense. But there was nothing. It was just like that. It made it seem like they just put that thing on a little sticky on the character and then just walked away from that. And that was annoying.
Yes, I remember that book.
Oh,
Sorry.
Yes, it was something. Jose?
Well, I think if you want to write an experience that isn't your lived experience, the big first thing I would say is go read authors who have had that experience. So if you want to write about Latinx people, who are the Latinx authors that you're reading? If you want to read about different diasporas, then who are the people that you're reading from those groups? And if your writing isn't informed, and not just fiction, also nonfiction, go read blogs where people talk about the terrible things that they've read and what the pitfalls were until you yourself can recognize those pitfalls and things that you read. Because if your writing isn't informed by anything authentic, then what can it possibly be informed by except stereotyping? So that's what I would say. And I would also say, and I said something very similar to this in a previous panel, so my apologies if I'm repeating myself here, but if you're going to write a culture that isn't your own, stay away from the stories the angst stories, because there's probably nuance to those stories that you're not equipped to wrestle with. So if you wanted to write a character like José Pablo Iriarte, and I've got light colored skin and I speak English pretty well, and I am pretty privileged, and you could just set me into whatever kind of, place you want. You need to not forget that my experience and my ethnicity does come up, but you don't need to, the whole wrestling with identity, that's not something that you're likely going to be able to get right. And so, I feel like if you're an outsider, you're really best off when you write something that's not your own, to just give people great experiences where they happen to X, Y, or Z, and not feel like it's your job to explain to the rest of North America what it's like to be, Cuban American, because you probably can't.
Right. Nikki?
thank you. I had to step out of where I was because I realized you couldn't see anything. So my apologies. If I made anybody nauseous, I'm really sorry as I move myself. I think for me, I hesitate to do the do's and don'ts because I was told a lot of don't do this, don't do that. And it hindered a lot of my writing until I found my voice that, like I said, writing humor, writing about food, even writing about what's going on in society, but doing it in a manner that worked for me. But definitely what José had said, where, you know, it's not always about us struggling. It's not always, you know, all stories don't have to be about coming out. I mean, if that's what you want to write about, that's great. But also remember, there's different stories to be told. Just like everybody wants to be the hero in a story, or the heroine, or the shero, or, you know, basically the main character that, you know, kicks butt, has a swashbuckling time, blows shit up, you know. That may just be me, but I like that in story.
Well, I like collecting spouses out of my books. That's my goal here. How many spouses do I have? And I have hundreds.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes they get fired, but, you know, I like collecting spouses.
Exactly. You collect them all, like Pokemon. Like little cards. But I think we have a tendency to want to emulate the authors that we love. And I know it's really easy to go, okay, I don't like this, I don't like that, because I'm the first person that will tell you, I didn't like this, I didn't like that, but I tend to do that too much, so I'm trying to get out of that habit. So the things that I find do work. When people talk about like finding your voice, I was like, well, what does that mean? You know, this is the way that I talk. Like, what do you mean in writing? What I found is when I stopped trying to emulate my, you know, the writers that I liked, and I just paid attention to how I interacted with people in general, how I told a story, and it came with more of a punchline. There's a certain rhythm to that, and I realized that is how I tell stories. If you read my work, it's usually like there is a beat to it. Like everybody's got a different beat. So mine is like, you know, dun 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 dun, pause, punchline. It's even when I don't try to, it's just there. But it also, voice, also telling a story. You don't have to do a full info dump on things, but tell a story that's slightly different. Realize that, like for me, I remember sitting up as a little kid thinking, why am I reading about these stories that take place in the past where we can write anything and it's still exactly the same past as it was, and there's still no people of color? And one of my mentors, my writing mentors, she heard me complain about it way too many times, and I guess she got real tired of me bitching, which was good, because she's like, I don't want to hear you whine anymore, write it. And I said, well, I want to read like a funny steampunk where, you know, it's a, you know, people are trying to date each other, but they can't really date each other. It's like this blind date that's from hell, and everything is misunderstood, and there's like a building that gets blown up, you know, because like it's a destruction site. And she's like, write it. So hence where I'm always like trying to blow something up. I love action. I swear to God, I'm not a pyro. But it's one of those things where I wasn't seeing a lot of action in romance stories, where I wanted to see us be heroes. I wanted to see us, you know, just really have fun, and still address certain issues. But thanks, Elizabeth. She says about you can't go wrong and blow things up. But it's just
she would know.
Yes. So it just, and also where you think that you don't have enough information. I have a bit of a science background just for fun, along with IT. And so I applied that with engineering, and I end up putting that in my murder mysteries, where I end up killing somebody with, it's a little ahead of its time, but it's still something I wanted to do, which was, I killed off the character, which starts everything going. I killed them off with a Rube Goldberg machine. So
nice.
It was like, it was this whole big elaborate thing, and it was on an airship. So it was fun to write. And it's one of those things where if I listened to all the don'ts, I never would have come up with that. So it's like, definitely you write your first draft for you. And as you get into the other drafts, you want to, you know, invite the reader in. You're not just telling your story, but you want to bring them in, you want to gather them in. So think of it from that perspective, especially when you're feeling down, or that scene isn't working, or whatever the case may be. Share your story, not just tell your story, but share it. Imagine that that one person, I swear to God, it's not just my mom reading my book. I think it's like one other fan. So I tell myself, write it for that one fan. You may only have that one fan, but you know, that person that always likes whatever comment you have. And you're like, you know what, if it weren't for you, I really wouldn't get this far. And you know, they like all your stuff. So it's like,
Right.
right for them.
If I could just
Okay.
make one comment.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that when I started out talking about that one book that I didn't like, the problem was not so much that I didn't like the characters. It's that, like you said, there doesn't have to be a conflict in there, and you don't have to info dump. But if someone is going to do something or have a portrayal that is antithetical to what that character is supposed to represent, show us why. Well, how did they
agree.
make that decision? In that way, if you understand that that's how they got there, and it fits with that character, and isn't just a product of bad research.
I agree. I agree, Arshad. I do. And that makes the most sense, where if we're going to go down that rabbit hole of, okay, I'm going to write about this character, we don't have to make it where it's, I mean, if it's morose, that's fine. But I think that you're right, where if we're going to go that route, at least, you know, pay the dues. Talk about this aspect, because you want to make sure that this is a 3D character. If you don't have enough time to do that, it just, like you said, putting a post-it note of, this is a brown person, like that, that doesn't work very well.
Yeah, if it doesn't fit with what a brown person is about,
yeah,
then it just doesn't fit, and it throws you out of the story.
Great.
Right. Okay, so we got the 1 minute call. So I will wrap. One of the things that as a reader and an editor, because I write for myself. I do oral storytelling with my nephew, but I don't look at a lot of the things that I don't tell my authors what not to do. I help them foster their voicing. If they want to write like African American vernacular English, you're going to learn how to do it with syntax. You're going to learn how to do this properly. If you're trying to portray an accent, I'm going to go find you someone to pay. I don't believe in free labor, to listen to them talk so that you can get that wording right in your story. Voicing is so important, and it helps you avoid stereotypes. But what I'm going to do, since we're wrapping up, I'm going to gather everyone's links, and I'm going to create a document. I'm going to put it in Queer Sci-Fi so that you can one-click your hearts out. And I'm going to also include a list of books and things that I recommend to my authors and to other readers on a very regular basis. You'll see me tweet these authors out daily. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to send them in to Queer Sci-Fi, and I can always make sure to pass them on to Arshad, Nikki, and José.
All right.
And thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.